Hello there. This is Bill McKibben, and I'm first of all just want to say, and I'll say it each time I do one of these, how grateful I am for this conference and for the idea of doing it without flying everybody all the hell over the place. Um, this is a smart way to be thinking about how we make the world work. Today, we're talking about this question of a kind of wartime emergency, about climate mobilization, about whether there are valid comparisons between the moment we find ourselves in now and the moment we found ourselves in as we engaged the war against fascism in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. And I'll just talk for a few minutes because I want to leave lots of room for Ezra or Margaret or whoever else to be digging in. Let me give you a kind of overview, perhaps, is the most useful thing I can do, because I spent much of the year thinking about this question for a long piece that I wrote for the New Republic. I do think that there are powerfully valid reasons to think about the climate crisis in the same way that we think about World War II. It's obviously not a perfect analogy. We don't want to have a shooting war, just the opposite. We want a huge nonviolent effort that ends up saving tens of millions of people, not killing them. But there are very real ways in which we are at war. We don't think about it that way normally, but think about the metrics by which we think about winning or losing in warfare. Is some adversary taking territory from us? Well, in this case, yes. Carbon and methane and those forces that pour them into the atmosphere are reducing, for instance, the size of the Arctic ice cap, and by enormous percentages. It's half the size it was just 30 years ago. That's not just land at the top or ice at the top of the planet. It's an unbelievably important strategic asset. Those millions of hectares of bright white ice reflect 80% of the sun's incoming rays back out to space. The blue water that's replacing them as we raise the temperature absorbs most of that incoming solar radiation and speeds up. Or are people being killed by this adversary? And the answer is obviously yes, on a very large scale, as we try to deal with the drought and the flood and the fire that now are spreading ever more rapidly. We learned a few weeks ago, for instance, from a new study that the rate of wildfire in the western U.S. is doubled over the last 40 years because of climate change. The attribution was very clear. We watch what happens in country after country as unprecedented drought drives people off their farms into cities in places like Syria, where they help destabilize already in unstable governments. And we end up with the madhouse and the dispersal that we see across the Middle East and now into Europe. This is what wars look and feel like. It's no wonder that the Pentagon, which whatever else you say about it, spends a lot of time thinking about threats, treats climate change as a serious one, maybe the most serious one, because they know that when people are on the move in large numbers, violence inevitably follows. The other question about whether it's a metaphor is just to imagine what it would mean to deal with it. And it would mean many things. It would mean people changing their behaviors, as indeed they did in wartime, using less, for instance, and being more careful. But it would also involve, and maybe preeminently, a huge effort to build the next energy infrastructure on this planet. Even if we manage to use a lot less energy, we're still going to be using a lot, and more people around the world are needing energy for the first time, using it for the first time. And cannot and should not be denied. So the question is where that will come from. And the good news is that just as the engineers at the dawn of the Second World War, sparked by the need for such invention, were quickly pioneering like radar and sonar, so the engineers here have been quickly pioneering solar and wind technology. They've done their job. The price of the solar panels come down 80% in the last 7 or 8 years. That's an enormous change. It's maybe the most important economic fact in the world, and it means we could go to work if we wanted to. What would that look like? Well, in the case of World War II, what it looked like was a government-directed effort to get industry up to speed, building things at the scale that we needed. The question was not, could we build a bomber? The question was, could we build enough of them fast enough to turn the tide of the war? And it turned out that we could. Building the world's largest factory in Willow Run, Michigan, within a year we were able to turn out a bomber, which is a big, complicated piece of machinery with 300,000 rivets. We were turning them out one an hour. We could and should be doing the same things with solar panels and turbine blades, churning them out at a remarkable rate as part of a coordinated plan to install them at a remarkable rate, a rate big enough to allow us to catch up with chemistry and physics. We found ourselves behind when we started World War II, just as we find ourselves starting behind now. But with sufficient application, we might be able to at least start catching up. It doesn't mean there won't be lots of damage done. There already has been. It does mean we might be able to stop climate change short of that place where it diminishes our chances of having a working civilization. One's always wary of using words like war because of their fraught history. We've had pointless and scurrilous things like the war on drugs and whatever. But I think in retrospect, World War II was probably a necessary war. And I think that we correctly honor those who had the foresight to go fight it in all its ways. Were they people on the battlefield or the Rosie the Riveters back home? In this case, we need not to vanquish other countries. We need to involve other countries in a great global alliance. And part of that means that we need, in effect, the Marshall Plan before the war. It means that or during the war, it means that we need to be making up for the fact that it is us in the West that have filled the atmosphere with carbon and put at risk especially the lives of people in the most vulnerable parts of the world. We need to be pouring resources into those places, both for moral and practical reasons, to allow them to leapfrog fossil fuel and to move ahead in the clean energy path. It's never easy to summon that kind of will and spirit, and I don't know for certain that we will summon it here. It's unclear precisely what our Pearl Harbor moment will be, but it's worth remembering that FDR, seeing what was coming, had made much of the switch before Pearl Harbor. The ships and planes that won the battle at Midway 6 months later were all basically built by the time Pearl Harbor happened. We need some of that foresight from our leaders now. We're hopeful that the Democrats, should they win the presidency, will honor their platform promise for a great climate emergency summit 100 days into their presidency. They'll need to have people like Margaret and Ezra and others in the room with the detailed plans for what to do. And they'll need to have the rest of us out in the street pushing hard, creating the demand for change. That's the only thing that'll actually lead to progress in the time we have. So thank you for being part of this conference, and more importantly, thank you for being part of the mobilization of all of us as a movement that will need to precede the mobilization of our country and the other countries of the world in this most epic of fights.